Welcome to the Divine Identity Podcast. In this episode, we are examining one of the most important statements in John's prologue. The Word was with God. Does that statement require a second eternal divine person, or is John describing a real distinction within the one God? We're going to dive right into this explainer and look closely at the source material to unpack exactly what kind of relation is going on here. Okay, so let's get into it. Interpretations of John 1:1 often just jump straight to identifying the Word as a distinct divine person. And, once you do that, the phrase with God naturally seems to back that up, right? But that conclusion actually skips a really crucial step. Before we can let the phrase with God, or the original Greek theon, tell us what kind of relation is being described, we first have to answer one huge central question. What does John actually mean by the Word? To figure that out, we really need to step into the scriptural world John himself lived in.
Section 1. The Scriptural Architecture. The one God who creates alone.
See, John didn't write his gospel in some theological vacuum. He inherited a very specific absolute boundary from Israel's scriptures. In Isaiah, Yahweh clearly declares that he is the one who made all things, that he alone stretched out the heavens by himself. Now, when we hear one God who creates alone, it's super easy to accidentally imagine this undifferentiated singularity, right? Like a blank slate where God has absolutely no internal distinctions. But that is actually a flawed concept. The biblical reality reveals one God, yes, but with real, distinguishable realities that belong to his own being and action. Scripture talks about God himself, his spirit, his form, his mouth, and his word. These aren't separate gods. They're actually real distinctions within the one God. A really great example of this is Psalm 33:6, which gives us this brilliant architectural map of divine speech. Just look at this ordered sequence. First, you have Yahweh himself as the personal acting subject. Second, the Spirit of God, which is his inner spirit, his inward divine life. Third, his mouth, which belongs to his personal living structure. And fourth, individual lowercase words that are basically expressions proceeding from him. It's an incredibly structured map of divine action, and it does this without separating God into multiple independent actors.
Moving on to Section 2, Defining Form and Word, Building the Scriptural Vocabulary.
So, when we use words like mouth or face for God, we always have to remember that because God is spirit, his attributes are entirely spiritual, not material flesh. Scripture explicitly says God has a form, but here's the key. Personal living structure is really just explanatory language for God's form. It definitely does not mean a material body, and it absolutely, positively, does not mean another consciousness or a separate personal I. It's simply God's own structured spiritual reality that intrinsically belongs to the one personal God himself. This essentially gives an objective reality to the Bible's bodily language about God without turning him into a physical being. And this brings us to a massive distinction. We just talked about a lowercase word as a preceding expression, but notice that John capitalizes it. In the beginning was the Word. John's word can't just be individual spoken expressions, because this word already was. It was with God and it was God. So the absolute crucial point to grasp here is this. Capital W Word functions as a revelatory designator. It foregrounds God's form in expressive, creative, and flesh-coming action, but, and this is huge, without turning Word into an autonomous second protagonist. God himself remains the one single personal acting subject.
Now, if you're sitting there wondering, did John really think this way? Well, John chapter 5 provides some incredible internal confirmation. Jesus is speaking about the Father here, and he explicitly links three specific things: voice, form, and word. So John's own gospel consistently distinguishes the Father, his voice, his form, and his word within one beautifully cohesive revelatory complex, meaning the architecture we're using to interpret the prologue, it's completely native to John's own thinking.
Let's look at Section 3, Relational Grammar and Pronouns, navigating he, him, and with God. As we read to the text, we constantly bump into pronouns like he and him, right? Well, because the Greek word for word, logos, is grammatically masculine, the text naturally just uses masculine pronouns. But to prove that grammatical reference isn't the same thing as a separate personal identity, we can actually use Proverbs 8 as a biblical control. In Proverbs 8, wisdom is heavily personalized. Wisdom speaks, calls out, rejoices. Yet we all know wisdom isn't a separate divine person. Wisdom foregrounds God's soul in counsel and purpose. In the exact same way, John 1 heavily personalizes the word. But just like wisdom, the word foregrounds God's form in expression and revelation. Strikingly personal grammar just doesn't automatically create a second divine person.
So what about creation then? John says all things were made through him.
While that might sound like a separate agent, remember Isaiah, Yahweh alone is the creator. When John says through him, he is simply foregrounding God's own form, designated as the Word, within the creative action itself. He is not transferring the act of creation to some independent subject. Through him merely identifies the divine reality through which the one creator acts.
And that brings us right to the famous phrase pros and theon, typically translated with God. Now, this grammar absolutely establishes a genuine relation and orientation, but watch out, because here's the trap. Popular paraphrases often translate this as face-to-face with God. And guys, that is an interpretive visualization, not John's literal wording. When you hear face-to-face, your imagination instantly introduces two distinct personal subjects before you've even figured out what the word is. The grammar actually expresses a genuine relation of God's form to God himself, without demanding two separate ontologies or minds.
Section 4. Word to flesh to son. The emergence of the incarnation.
Building on all this, we reach a really decisive transition in verse 14. We move from the eternal reality of the Word straight into the historical emergence of the incarnation. The Word became flesh and lived among us. We absolutely have to preserve the full spectacular force of this statement. But keep our definitions in mind. The designation Word does not suddenly become an independent actor here. God's form is the divine referent being foregrounded in this flesh coming. God himself remains the one divine personal subject doing the acting. The form doesn't just detach from God to go on a solo mission.
If we apply the emergence pattern established all the way back in Genesis 2:7, this sequence makes total sense. First, the Word, meaning God, by his Spirit gives his own form as the spiritual constituent. Second, the flesh coming, where Mary supplies the physical constituent. And third, the Son. From this union emerges one real human soul being, Jesus. The form does not indwell an already existing man, and it doesn't become a separate consciousness. God's own form literally acts as the spiritual constituent of the Son.
Section 5, John 1:1, brought together, the three clauses without remainder.
So with all this theological and grammatical foundation built, we can now loop back and flawlessly read John 1:1 without forcing any of its clauses to cancel each other out. Notice how beautifully this resolves. The Word was establishes divine existence. It wasn't just a spoken sound. It was already there. The Word was with God, establishes genuine ordered distinction. God's form is genuinely distinguishable from God's divine soul. And finally, the Word was God, establishes inseparable divine identity. The form isn't some external companion. It belongs intrinsically to the one divine identity. So what does this all mean for us? Well, the grammar establishes real relation, and the scriptural architecture identifies that Word functions as the revelatory designator for God's form. It shows us real distinction without separation. And if a second eternal divine I isn't required, this actually deepens our awe. It means the intimate relation of the historical Son to the Father has a profoundly real ontological basis. The Father's own form is constitutive of who Jesus is. It leaves us with such a beautiful, unified mystery to ponder. This cohesive framework proves that real distinction within the one God is logically coherent and spiritually profound. For a fuller exploration of this teaching, read theologian and teacher Igor Pagoda's article, What Does It Mean That the Word Was with God?, available at christrooted.org.